One-hit KO moves and evasion. These two have been banned from competitive singles from the very beginning. One-hit KO and evasion moves are banned because they turn games into overt gambling with no conception of counters. Forget making intelligent moves to play around your opponent, it's all down to who gets the dice roll. The game has enough problems with luck without 100% accurate moves like Earthquake suddenly missing. Many Pokemon become incredibly broken when you can't reliably hit them. And no, Aerial Ace is not a counter, because though it may never miss, it also doesn't actually do much damage. Evasion Clause was initially just the moves Double Team and Minimize, but eventually came to include the held items Bright Powder and Laxatives as well. Meanwhile, one-hit KO moves' absurdity comes from complete defiance of the entire damage system in favor of automatically KOing the target, should it land. 30% accuracy seems terrible until you realize these are the same odds as the regular occurrence that is fishing for a burn with Scald, except with infinitely higher payoff. Removing one-hit KO clause was actually tested at a point in Gen 5 Ubers, but wouldn't you know it, Kyogre running around with sheer code and thus being able to one-hit KO things like Grass Arceus and the Lati Twins was in fact not good for competition. Evasion Clause also extends to include two other bans. The first one is the Sandveil ability, but this one took a while for Sandveil to fall under Evasion Clause, despite many years of furious player complaints. But one of the most prominent examples of really anything being broken when it's dodging 100% moves is how Cacturn was regularly crushing teams in multiple generations while dodging moves under permanent sand. Even Gligar dominated Gen 3 in much of the same way, as it often took just one miss for its Swords Dance boosted attacks to spiral out of control. And when it's spamming Substitute looking for that miss, it's probably going to get hit. Best case scenario, you have to hit a bunch of consecutive 80% moves, meaning you basically have to hit repeated Stone Edges. Nobody sane would rely on the actual Stone Edge to do this, and eventually came around to the idea that 100% moves like Ice Beam should not be Stone Edge. Of course, if Cacturn and Gligar were busted with Sandveil, Gliscor and Garchomp were no-brainers. Sandveil under the permanent sand of Gens 3 to 5 was one thing, but players eventually tried fishing for misses under Smooth Rock Extended Sand with Sandveil Garchomp, even after it had a great alternate ability in Rough Skin, and the player base decided there's just no reason for such RNG exclusive cheese to exist, other than in Gen 7 where nobody really tried it. Snowcloak eventually joined Sandveil, though it's tougher to abuse, since Abomasnow isn't nearly as splashable or reliable a weather setter in the world of Tyranitar and Hippowdon, and stacking Ice Cloak Pokemon, aka defensively deficient ice types, alongside the already tough to add Abomasnow doesn't exactly make for a reliable core. But if you're dedicated to nothing but cheesing RNG for wins, Snowcloak can indeed be just as infuriating, with Frostlass able to throw Thunder Wave and even Confuse Ray in the mix, so you're really not hitting it. Sadly, Snowcloak not being allowed also effectively banned Frostlass from Gen 4, since it had no alternate ability, thus ridding the tier of an otherwise harmless, thoroughly unique lead spiker. While Singles doesn't use Item Clause, the official competitive format VGC has an Item Clause. While Singles is often characterized by one item multiple times on the same team, most famously Leftovers, doubles, especially with the 4v4 format, with nary an entry hazard to worry about, would almost certainly be overrun by even more Focus Sashes, with it being such an excellent default catch-all item for pretty much everything. Not that there aren't other items one might want to use multiple of course, but many good teams often find themselves making concessions in a Pokemon's item slot to free the option up on another. Imagine, for instance, the incredible flexibility of having two Trick Room setters able to shrug off Taunt with Mental Herb. Having more than one Pokemon on the same team. This strategy is prevented by the Species Clause, which is simple. You can only use one of each Pokemon on a team. No matter how powerful a Pokemon is, it tends to be balanced by the fact that there's only one of them. Even well-built teams can have an immensely difficult time withstanding some of the scarier threats out there. To run into just two of them would be far too much, especially for Pokemon that can viably run different sets. Forget having to make that trade-off, now you can run, for example, both Choice Scarf and Nasty Plot Goldengo, but even just being able to throw two of the same beast at the opponent would often be too much, let alone more extreme examples like various forms of Arceus. Species Clause is also defined by Pokedex number, so you couldn't say use both Slowking and Galarian Slowking on the same team, despite them being quite different. Sleep is banned in competitive singles because it's very broken. Seeing as if unrestricted sleep was effectively multiple free KOs or at least free turns galore, it's always been a controversial status, but banning it outright just like one-hit KO moves or evasion felt too extreme. Not just because status conditions feel like such an essential part of the game, but because of the alternative offered by Pokemon Stadium and early official Nintendo tournaments, which was Sleep Clause, which means you can only sleep one of your opponent's Pokemon at a time. Despite Stadium not being a mainline game and battle between mainline games being what was simulated online, This was enough of a precedent to declare sleep an exception and mod the simulator so that if an opponent already has had a Pokemon slept, not including self-induced sleep, by using a move like rest, then a sleep move's effect will fail against a second target. Those who played on cartridge, such as in the days of the popular 4th generation Wi-Fi battles, didn't have this enforcement, but attempted to follow suit, largely successfully. You wouldn't try to sleep another Pokemon or you'd lose on the spot. It'd be different if you were forced into doing so, i.e. if a trap Pokemon was encored into the sleep move, but that was of course an exception and incredibly rare. However, two things. One, this did eventually spark the train of thought that would lead to the rule set's questioning. It wasn't just that the simulator blocking a would-be second sleep was mechanically impossible on cartridge, but that if sleep was so broken that it needed game mechanics change to keep it around, maybe it should just be banned in the first place, an idea that gradually became more acceptable. Additionally, sleep being mechanically modified changed available play routes. For example, on the simulator, you could spam sleep against a sleeping Pokemon so that if it stayed in and woke up, you'd immediately sleep it again, and if they switched out, the move would just fail. This was often an optimal move to maximize an advantage against a sleeping target, but wouldn't be something you could do on the cartridge, since if the opponent switched and you slept another Pokemon, you'd break Sleep Clause and lose. However, thanks to tradition, Sleep Clause is still around in all but 3 gens, the 4th, the 5th, and the 9th. And that's because they saw fit to ban sleep outright. Even with the Sleep Clause, sleep is often an overwhelmingly powerful status when used against just one target at a time for the same reasons it was too broken to allow against multiple targets. It shut opponents down so completely with such limited reliable counterplay to the end of multiple free turns, often close to a free KO, and playing around it was usually unreliable and RNG heavy. Sleep was eventually banned in these generations for its volatility in enabling certain already dangerous Pokemon to overtly restrictive extremes. Freeze. Freeze clause also had precedent in Stadium and early Nintendo tournaments on the same principle as sleep, but this mod to limit it on simulator was one that really couldn't be reasonably replicated in the mainline games. Its Gen 1 origins were born of necessity though, because in Gen 1, freeze is permanent. You would actively have to try to thaw your opponent out, whether by a very rare fire move or the useless haze, which effectively means that yes, once you're frozen, you're KO'd. All the ice beams and blizzards thrown around RBY with regularity mean that a freeze is always around the corner, often being actively aimed for, to the extent that not only are freezes incredibly common, freeze clause actually kicks in to block the second freeze quite often, and it is a necessity because getting 2 free KOs is just unfair. The alternatives are to ban all freeze moves, which nobody wants to do considering how essential Ice Beam and Blizzard are, power and coverage wise, or to simply accept 2 or possibly even more freezes, which if you want things competitive, you don't want that. Pokemon being able to defrost on their own was introduced in Gen 2, but at a rate of only 10%, and with how easy it was to dish the freezes out, it was decided that the game was still better off for having freeze clause around, except for one occasion where the non-Gen 2 players in charge of rule sets removed it on a whim, to which the Gen 2 player base's response was to rack up so many important tournament games with multiple freezes that eventually freeze clause was voted back in. The faster pace of play starting in Gen 3 and the defrost rate now being 20% meant multiple freezes were no longer really a viable team strategy, but the clause was kept simply because Ice Punch Jirachi could very feasibly grab multiple freezes on its own thanks to Serene Grace doubling the freeze rate to 20%. Freeze clause was kept for this reason in Gen 4, but was phased out in Gen 5, where the pace of the play was fast enough to make freezes rare. Additionally, the introduction of Scald, which thawed out its user if frozen, brought a popular, easily found anti-freeze option. Glitches and game freezes. Although all of Arceus' creations are perfect in their own way, sometimes missing no interferes. Glitch clauses refers to major game-breaking glitches like the Acid Rain glitch in Gen 4, which caused Sand and Rain to be active at the same time, having Pokemon like Cherrim and Castform experience an existential crisis that locked you out of the game, or the infamous Skydrop glitch in Gen 5, which literally kidnapped your opponent's Pokemon like it was Zelda at the beginning of a game. Other examples include the Dragon Shear glitch in Gen 9, the String Shot, Forest Curse, Power Trick, and Curse glitch in Gen 7, and the Invulnerability glitch in Gen 1. The gist of all these is simple. They force the specific games they are in to crash, enter an inescapable loop, alter game mechanics dramatically, or even make Pokemon untouchable. Preventing the game from being played was more than enough of a reason to ban or prevent these situations in both singles and VGC. Endless battle. There are some strategies that try to stall, but not in the classic sense. Usually stall teams are just trying to win by making you faint through drawn out passive damage, but they're still trying to make you faint, and thus trying to win. Some strategies though, involve literally trying to make the battles endless. The only way out is to reach a tie through a turn limit, or for the opponent to forfeit out of frustration. But actually winning isn't the goal of anyone using strategies like the infamous Slowbro set named Funbro, which consists of using block to trap a defensive Pokemon, then even PP stalling them with Slack Off, the PP restoring Leopard Berry, and the Berry restoring Recycle. Once the opponent is out of PP, they'll begin to struggle, but rather than allowing them to be KO'd by their own struggle recoil, Funbro heals them back up with Heal Pulse endlessly, thanks to Leopard Berry and Recycle. Rather than allowing such purgatory, any strategy in this vein that could theoretically make battles go on forever is banned, and that's how the Endless Battle Clause was created. Weather plus Speed ability. This was the original complex ban that stirred up incredible controversy. In order to prevent rain from being banned, the decision was made to maintain Generation 5 as the weather generation and to make the unprecedented call to ban Drizzle and Swift Swim on the same team. You could still use Swift Swim Kingdra, just not on the same team as Drizzle Politoed. Years down the line, this was extended to include Drought and Chlorophyll, as Sun teams and the brutally dominant Venusaur had taken over the metagame. Sandrush, on the other hand, was banned outright. It didn't start this way though. Excadrill was banned outright in Black and White 1, but eventually was brought back alongside the Chloral Sun ban and allowed in the same way. Excadrill could use Sand Rush so long as it wasn't paired with Sandstream. If it wanted to be used on a Sand team, it needed to use Sand Force or Mold Breaker. However, Excadrill wound up being incredibly broken when used on Rain teams to counter Sand, forcing them in a lose-lose situation where they won the Weather War and would either get swept by a Pokemon that was too broken for them to use themselves, or they would lose the Weather War and thus defeat the entire purpose of using Sand in the first place, which was to avoid getting trampled by super boosted water moves. Simply having Sandrush Excadrill available at all was too disruptive in a metagame that relied on Tyranitar to check monsters like Rain and Latios, and thus Sandrush was banned outright. Baton Pass. Oh boy, Baton Pass has been variously claused a lot over the generations as they've tried to keep it around in some guides, but it's consistently proved itself to be broken even after being limited many times. For that reason, the first subset is the full Baton Pass ban from Gen 6 to 9. The move itself is completely disallowed. The second subset is Baton Pass with no boost in Gens 4 and 5. You can Baton Pass a substitute, or you can use it as a pseudo U-turn where you can't pass boosts of any kind at all. In Gen 3, this is where it gets complicated. First, there's the Trap Pass clause, which also came to exist in Gen 2. Basically, you cannot use both Baton Pass and a trap move like Block, Mean Look, or Spiderweb. Next, there's one Boost Passer clause, which means you can only have one Pokemon with both Baton Pass and a way to boost its stats. You can have more Pokemon with Baton Pass on your team, but they can't boost their stats at all. Additionally, thanks to Baton Pass stat clause, you cannot Baton Pass a speed boost. Calm Mind, Swords Dance, sure, but not so much as a speed boost from Selactberry. Additionally, Soundproof is banned, as that ability can stifle Roar or even the rare Perish Song, and this threw a wrench in the already limited Baton Pass counterplay, and this does mean that Mr. Mime, the Soundproof using Baton Passer, is effectively Uber, since it doesn't have an alternate ability. Smeargle also cannot use Ingrain, a rare complex ban from the days when full Baton Pass chains relied on the healing from the move. It's only Dugtrio, they said. It's not actually that strong, they said, until it proved to be so ridiculously busted by removing Tyranitar, Heatran, and several other metagame staples, which opened the floodgates for various Dugtrio teammates to sweep with ridiculous ease. Its reach was immense, because most Pokemon are grounded, and Dugtrio can do something, if not more, to a lot of them, in ways they can't escape and lead to major advantages for its teammates. Whether it was using Focus Sash to switch directly into Kyurem Black for full-powered reversals, or simply ruining a would-be threat like Garchomp with a Toxic that it couldn't escape from, blocking the opponent's ability to switch was enormous as it was malleable, and swung decision-making too much, its outcomes favoring the trapping side. It was so dangerous that even Diglett was busted. Generation after generation, they made the discovery and banned Arena Trap, except its inaugural Gen 3. But Dugtrio is also immensely controversial in that metagame, and it's been talked about having the ban extend there as well. Well, if Arena Trap was bad for trapping grounded Pokemon, Shadow Tag trapping almost literally everything was far worse. It was functionally banned for Generations 3 and 4 because Wobbuffet was broken, and nobody wanted to take any chances with Wynot pulling any mini Wobbuffet shenanigans either. But in Gen 5, Gothitelle was released with Shadow Tag, and it seemed quite a terrible Pokemon. At least Wobbuffet had guaranteed KOs with Counter and Mirror Coat, and even Encore. What was Gothitelle gonna do? Well, in Gen 6, Gothitelle demonstrated that simply tricking a Scarf on a key Pokemon was ruinous in much of the same way that Dugtrio Toxic might be, and enabled all kinds of nasty strategies, namely stall, which promptly inspired Gen 5 players to do the same. And much like Dugtrio was imitated by Diglett, Gothitelle was followed by Gothorita to similarly aggravating effect. Dark Void. Finally, this is a ban undertaken by Gamefreak themselves. Well, not technically a ban, but this nerf was absolutely meant as a ban on the previously dominant strategy in 2016 VGC, where Dark Void Smeargle completely took over the metagame. Sleeping both targets was absurdly powerful in a restricted format with monsters like Geomancy Xerneas. Many players were crying for something to be done about it. Well, that's just what Gamefreak did. Even if not until the next gen, they just did it in the worst way possible. Dark Void was Darkrai's signature move, so they made it fail if used by any other Pokemon. Okay, good enough. Smeargle won't be Dark Voiding anything anymore. True, but also what if Dark Void's accuracy was 50% now? Yeah, I don't know who this was supposed to be helping, considering that as a mythical Pokemon, Darkrai wasn't even allowed in VGC, which is why it was Smeargle that was Dark Voiding the VGC meta to begin with. But hey, the inner machinations of Game Freak's mind are a mystery. Swagger. Prankster Swagger was the initial terror, and it also dominated VGC. But turns out you can throw Swagger on pretty much everything as a last resort catch-all and have it work out for you fairly reliably. 50% or even a couple 50% is actually very, very good odds, much likelier than anything else you're going to have in the situation you're using it in. That's exactly why it's so undesirable. Even if you're going to lose, you always have this option. Swagger did indeed have the nasty tendency to rather consistently bail players out of situations that were almost sure losses through just a few lucky turns, and thus in almost every generation, Swagger is banned in smoke and singles formats. It's only still allowed in Gen 2, where the general bulk level and long length of games make it far less effective. Moody's extreme boost often came from an evasion boost kicking in, meaning you would now miss even accurate moves against the Pokemon spamming substitute and gaining more boosts every single turn. Bidoof using it to sweep Ubers made this argument as ironclad as it gets. In a similar vein, under Gen 5's permanent Rain Dish Tentacruel could also wait for extreme boosts while guarding itself with substitute and protect, except those boosts came from acupressure, which also just needed one evasion boost to allow Tentacruel or Toxicroak for that matter to boost everything else and eventually sweep. And thus the Moody clause and acupressure clause were initiated. Soldew used to give Latios and Latias a 50% boost to special attack and special defense. In other words, it was a free calm mind. Being so powerful and bulky, it's what made them so dominant in Ubers and would have made them far too powerful for OU. Even non-Soldew Lati twins were too much for Gen 3, but starting in Gen 4, well, Gen 4 Latias and Gen 5 Latios were still quite controversial, with Latias being banned for a long time and Latios always discussed as broken, but they were no longer the obvious, undeniable Ubers that they were with their signature item. Soldew was no longer banned after being nerfed in Gen 7 to only provide a 20% boost to both of their stab moves, just like Dialga and Palkia's Adamant and Lustrous Orbs. Still a decent item choice, but nowhere near broken in OU any longer, and also no longer worthwhile in Ubers either. Assist is also banned in Generation 5, but for a different reason. With the right team setup, Liepard could utilize Prankster Assist to only call phasing moves in Roar and Whirlwind, meaning it would repeatedly phase the opponent before they could move, taking out entire teams with hazard damage. This was a gimmick, but one that could and did grab free wins against certain teams. Since Assist offered nothing else in the metagame, it was banned. However, Assist wreaking havoc didn't stop there. In VGC, a strategy known as Dive Cats became infamous for a similar reason as Skydrop. Basically, you could make your team centered around Prankster Assist from Liepard and Purloin, and they would only call the move Dive. Since Dive would always go first, both Liepard and Purloin would disappear from the field, making them unable to be hit. Since the second part of Dive is an actual attack, it no longer is called by Prankster and is put into a no priority state, which means it always went second. This allowed the cats to always hit your opponent but remain unhittable the entire game until the timer ran out and you eventually won by having more HP. Now, this technically wasn't banned in the rule set, and it did have counterplay with Prankster Taunt, especially from Thundurus, or just hitting them with faster priority moves like Extreme Speed, but Game Freak did patch the game in Gen 6 to account for this by having Assist never called Dive, and then they just removed Assist in Gen 8. So we will count it as a pseudo-ban strategy. Sleep Trap. Sleep Perish Trap was an old Gen 2 ban to prevent Mischievous from getting free KOs by trapping the opponent with Mean Look, putting them to sleep with Hypnosis, and leaving them hapless against Perish Song. Turns out though that even without Perish Song in the mix, Sleep Trap alone was a major problem. With Sleep Claws activated, being able to switch your slept Pokemon out was a major part of dealing with sleep. But when that wasn't an option, Mischievous could still grab free KOs with Ghost Curse, which would rip off a massive 25% of the opponent's health per turn, and quickly heal back the 50% it lost with Pain Split, which further accelerated the pace of the curse KOing its target. This, as well as the dangers of Smeargle sleep trapping before baton passing its spiderweb against a hapless target that would freely give Snorlax 6 curses, led to the combination of sleeping and trapping being deemed ban-worthy as well. Last Respects and Shed Tail. This pair of moves were among the most ludicrously broken introduced by Gen 9, at least in singles, which is no small feat. Last Respects takes the concept of King Gambit's Supreme Overlord, where it gets stronger for each fainted teammate, and packs it into a ghost move, the best offensive type in the game. It starts at 50 base power and gains 50 for each fainted teammate, meaning it very quickly reaches absurd levels of power that, even with Houndstone's unimpressive 101 attack, winds up one-hit killing just about everything. This is far too great a punishment for the opponent doing what they have to do to win, which is KOing the opponent's Pokemon, and thus it was banned. Meanwhile, Baton Passing Substitute was always a solid strategy, but what if you could do both at the same time? Well, that would of course be insanely strong in any generation, let alone the most power-crept of all, and it's assisted by the fact that Cyclizar had an incredible base 121 speed, the same as Tornadus Therian. Oh, but Shed Tail's drawback is that it requires 50% health, and not the 25% that Substitute demands, so it's not as bad, right? Well, putting aside the fact that it's still an insanely strong boost to pass to such dangerous Pokemon, even this doesn't work since Cyclizar has Regenerator as its ability, meaning it's healing up to comfortably pull off another Shed Tail as soon as it uses the first one. You could lump this in under Baton Pass in general being broken, but even aside from that, Shed Tail was just far too powerful. The Cleric Clause exists to fix more Gen 1 and 2 absurdity. When you go into a Link battle, which is what is simulated in each generation, your team is healed to full, except for in the first 2 generations. There you take whatever damage you already had into battle, be it less than full HP or status conditions. This would allow, most notably in Gen 1, certain Pokemon like Chansey, Starmie, and Alakazam to go into battle burned. Now, inflicting status on yourself like this seems strange until you realize it's only 6.25% per turn on Pokemon that have reliable recovery, and just as importantly, can no longer be slept, frozen, or paralyzed, i.e. have turns taken away from them, which would be hugely disruptive. Additionally, partial multi-turn trapping moves like Wrap and Clamp are sometimes played around with by PP Stall, but the PP Stalling player has to be careful, because if the Wrap target switches before Wrap's current duration ends, Wrap will be automatically used again, deducting PP, unless you switch out from the live duration of the last Wrap that just ran out of PP. If this is done, Wrap's PP will roll over and go right back to maximum. This is fine when you just assume Wrap's maximum PP as per full PPs, as is the standard of competitive play. But what happens if the Wrap user goes into battle having used one already, making it run out of PP one turn earlier than you could possibly know, and you accidentally just brought it back to full? Utter chaos for an already controversial strategy. As such, the Cleric Clause ensures all battles are played with fully healthy teams. Quick Claw and King's Rock and Razorfang. These items follow in the vein of Bright Powder and Lax Incense. Whereas those 2 luck items were banned under Evasion Clause, these 3 are banned for their own effects. Quick Claw's 20% chance to allow its user to move first, no matter how much it's outsped by its opponent, had all sorts of game-ruining potential on major wall breakers kept in check by their low speed. Meanwhile, King's Rock and Razorfang's 10% flinch chance was used by faster Pokemon for a chance to cheese past their counters with free hits. They were most commonly used on Shell Smash Cloyster, whose guaranteed 5 hits of Skill Link Icicle Spear meant it had a roughly 41% chance to get a flinch. This was too powerful on a dangerous boosting sweeper that already had limited answers, and as these items only existed for cheese, they were banned, with the exception of King's Rock in Gen 7, where Cloyster wasn't nearly as good, and Razorfang in Gen 8, where it wasn't in the game. Gems. What if you had Z crystals that could be activated by more than one Pokemon in a battle? Of course, you can't pick and choose when you use them like Z moves, as gems are activated by the first attack of their respective type. But with such insane power, who cares? Once players realized Z moves had this sort of unlimited precedent, Hyper Offense teams spamming gems on multiple boosting sweepers overwhelmed the tier. The sheer power of Bug Gem Volcarona and Icicle Gem Cloyster smashed through even bulky Pokemon, often resists as well, and if their power wasn't enough, they could run gems of a different type to ruin other counters. Most common was simply spamming Stab though, and not just on these Pokemon arguably broken in their own right. Monsters like Dragon Gem, Dragon Dance, Dragonite, and Fighting Gem Breloom, among others, were similarly brutal to deal with. Gems were banned outright, though since Cloyster was also soon banned, some claimed that if Volcarona were banned as well, nothing else in the tier would be broken with gems, and thus they could be unbanned. And in Gen 2, you could actually trade back in generational time to the Gen 1 games, but you couldn't send any new Pokemon or moves, of course. But in Gen 2, some Gen 1 Pokemon received new access to Gen 1 moves, and as both had technically existed in Gen 1, they could be sent back together just fine. These newly gained tradeback moves were major metagame shaking changes. The most significant and devastating was Lovely Kiss Snorlax, which would completely upend Gen 1, as well as things like Ice and Thunder Punch Alakazam. But there were many, to the point where it was almost a completely different metagame from classic Gen 1. Technically, there's no real reason Gen 1 shouldn't have been updated once Gen 2 came out. It's a strange situation that doesn't really have any comparison, of course, but Gen 1 players themselves said it's basically like when the third game comes out and adds new things. Like after Diamond and Pearl, when Platinum gave Scizor Bullet Punch, among many other additions. Gen 1 not just kept its old metagame out of tradition, but because it didn't have the player base to accurately tier the nightmare that would be dealing with all the new broken stuff, with a Snorlax ban being just the very beginning. Editor Kellen here. I'm glad I caught this right before rendering. The final ban strategy in Smoke and Singles is of course Dynamax, from all of their formats in Gen 8. They originally played around with legalizing it in Ubers, but it was deemed too powerful even there, and it's not hard to see why. It's clearly a very powerful generational mechanic balanced around doubles rather than singles. Dynamax was banned in singles formats due to its sheer ability to overpower opponents, not only with unpredictability, but the boost in HP and stats that could be attained with different moves, notably Max Airstream, which made already terrifying threats faster than anything as well. Shoutouts to Gyarados for being utterly broken in the very early stages of Gen 8 by spamming Max Airstream. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Creek, Eric Dissing, Espion Lover, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Schmooter, Seagulls Incorporated, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soros and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zathor for their major support of our videos.